Little boy followed his dog, accidentally discovers a shocking secret. Max had never seen Scout act this way before. The golden retriever, usually the most easygoing dog in the world, stood rigid in the sterile hallway of Pine Grove Nursing Home, his tail straight as an arrow and his ears perked forward like satellite dishes. A low whine escaped his throat. "What's wrong, boy?" 12-year-old Max whispered, glancing around the quiet corridor. The antiseptic smell that seemed to permeate every corner of the building made his nose wrinkle. They were supposed to be visiting Great Aunt Sarah in room 204, but Scout had suddenly veered off course, pulling Max down this dimly lit side hallway he'd never noticed before. The Sunday afternoon visits to Great Aunt Sarah had become a monthly ritual for the Thompson family over the past year. Max's mother insisted it was important to maintain family connections, even though Great Aunt Sarah rarely remembered their names anymore and spent most visits talking about her cat, Mr. Whiskers, who died sometime in the 1980s. Today had started like any other visit. Max's father had grumbled about missing the football game, his mother had brought fresh flowers, and Max had tagged along with Scout, who was a certified therapy dog and allowed in the facility. But something was different this time. Scout's nails clicked against the linoleum as he crept forward, nose twitching. The hallway they turned down looked older than the rest of the building, with flickering fluorescent lights and faded wallpaper that might have been cheerful once but now just looked tired. At the end stood a heavy wooden door, its paint chipped and worn, with a simple brass handle and a keypad lock mounted above it. "Hey, you two shouldn't be down here," a sharp voice called out. Max turned to see Mrs. Hendricks, one of the senior nurses, power walking toward them with her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the floor. She was a thin woman with pepper-gray hair pulled back so tightly it made her eyes look slightly stretched, and she never seemed particularly fond of their monthly visits with Scout. But before Max could apologize and turn back, Scout did something completely unexpected. The normally well-behaved therapy dog launched into a series of sharp, urgent barks, something he'd been trained never to do inside the facility. The sound echoed off the walls like gunshots in the quiet hallway. "Scout!" Max grabbed the dog's collar, feeling the tremors running through his pet's body. "I'm so sorry, Mrs. Hendricks. He's never done this before." Mrs. Hendricks's face had gone pale, her hands fluttering like startled birds. Just get him out of here. This is a restricted area, storage for old medical supplies. Nothing interesting at all." She stepped forward, attempting to herd them back toward the main corridor. But Scout planted his feet, refusing to budge. Another whine escaped him, this one more desperate, almost pleading. Max had seen Scout interact with hundreds of patients over the years, the elderly, the sick, even the dying, and he never witnessed him behave like this. "Is there someone in there?" Max asked, his eyes drawn back to the mysterious door. "It sounds like, is that humming?" Indeed, beneath Scout's whines, a faint melody seemed to drift from behind the door, an old tune that tickled something in Max's memory, though he couldn't quite place it. It reminded him of the songs his grandmother used to sing, before she passed away 2 years ago. "Absolutely not," Mrs. Hendricks said too quickly, her voice pitched slightly higher than normal. "Now I must insist you return to the authorized areas of the facility. Your Great Aunt Sarah will be wondering where you are." Max allowed himself to be led away, practically dragging Scout, who kept looking back over his shoulder at the door. But something about the situation felt wrong, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit. He'd been coming to Pine Grove for over a year, and he'd never seen Mrs. Hendricks so flustered. Plus, there was something about that humming. Later, as his family prepared to leave, Max noticed something else odd. His father had stepped away to use the restroom, and Max had wandered back toward the nurse's station to fill Scout's water bowl. That's when he overheard Mrs. Hendricks speaking in hushed tones to another nurse. "Getting worse. He was singing that old lullaby again," Mrs. Hendricks whispered. "And now with the dog. I told them this arrangement wouldn't work forever." "Sure," the other nurse hissed, noticing Max hovering nearby. Both women quickly dispersed, leaving Max standing there with an empty water bowl and a head full of questions. On the drive home, Max couldn't stop thinking about the incident. Scout sat in the back seat beside him, calmer now but still occasionally letting out small whimpers. Through the rearview mirror, Max caught his father glancing back at them with an unreadable expression. "Scout was acting weird today," Max ventured, watching his father's reflection carefully. "Down that back hallway." His father's hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles turning white. "Dogs get spooked sometimes, son. Probably just smelled some cleaning supplies or something." But Max noticed his mother's hand move to rest on his father's arm, a gesture she usually reserved for when he was upset. And there was something else. Just for a moment, when Max had mentioned the hallway, he could have sworn he saw tears in his mother's eyes. That night, lying in bed with Scout curled up beside him, Max made a decision. Something was hidden behind that locked door, something that made his dog bark, his father tense up, and Mrs. Hendricks nervous. And somehow, deep in his gut, he knew it had something to do with his family. Tomorrow was a teacher workday, no school. His mother would be at her book club, and his father had a business meeting in the city. Max ran his fingers through Scout's soft fur, feeling the dog's tail thump against the mattress. "What do you say, boy?" he whispered. "Want to solve a mystery?" Scout's brown eyes seemed to glow in the darkness, and his tail thumped harder. Whatever secret lay behind that door, Max had a feeling his four-legged friend had already figured it out. Now it was his turn to discover the truth. The following morning dawned gray and drizzly, perfect weather for what Max considered his first real investigation. He'd spent half the night watching detective shows on his tablet, taking mental notes on surveillance and stealth. Now, with his parents gone and Scout eagerly following him down the stairs, Max felt like a proper investigator. He packed his detective kit carefully, a small flashlight, his phone, fully charged, a notebook and pen, and, most importantly, the Pine Grove Nursing Home volunteer badge he'd received last summer when he'd helped with their garden project. The badge had expired, but Max figured it might still help him blend in if anyone questioned his presence. Getting to Pine Grove wasn't difficult. It was only a 15-minute bike ride from his house, and Scout was used to running alongside him. The tricky part would be getting inside with Scout without arousing suspicion. Usually, therapy dogs needed to be scheduled in advance. "Okay, boy," Max whispered as they approached the building's side entrance, the one employees usually used. "Remember how we practiced being quiet?" Scout wagged his tail but remained silent. Max had spent an hour that morning practicing the quiet command, rewarding Scout with his favorite treats. Now came the moment of truth. They got lucky. As they approached the door, a young orderly was wheeling out some empty food carts. Max quickly grabbed the door before it closed, flashing his old volunteer badge. The orderly, busy with the carts, barely glanced at them. The Sunday crowds were absent, making it easier to move through the halls unnoticed, but also leaving them more exposed. Max's heart pounded as they made their way toward the mysterious hallway, Scout leading the way with confident steps. Just before they reached the turn, Max heard voices approaching. Without thinking, he ducked into a supply closet, pulling Scout in with him. Through the crack in the door, he watched Mrs. Hendricks walk past with another nurse he didn't recognize. "Needs his medication by noon," Mrs. Hendricks was saying. "And make sure he eats something this time. He's been refusing meals again, keeps saying he's waiting for someone." Once their footsteps faded, Max and Scout continued their journey. The hallway looked different in the morning light, somehow older, sadder. The humming from yesterday was gone, replaced by a heavy silence that made the hair on Max's neck stand up. They reached the door, and Scout immediately pressed his nose against the bottom crack, sniffing intently. Max examined the keypad lock. It looked old, with some numbers more worn than others. He remembered another detail from his late-night detective research: frequently used codes often wore down specific buttons. The numbers 1, 4, 7, and 9 showed more wear than the others. Max bit his lip, thinking. 4 numbers. His heart jumped when he realized 1947. That would have been right after World War II. Worth a try. His fingers trembled as he punched in the numbers. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, a soft click, and the door opened just a crack. Max held his breath, waiting for an alarm to sound. When nothing happened, he pushed the door open wider, wincing at the slight creak of old hinges. The room beyond was nothing like the storage space Mrs. Hendricks had described. Sunlight filtered through a dusty window, illuminating what looked like a small apartment. A narrow bed sat against one wall, its covers neatly made. A dresser with framed photographs. A small table with a chess set, pieces frozen mid-game. And in an old rocking chair by the window sat an elderly man, his back to the door, seemingly lost in thought. Scout's tail began wagging furiously, but he remained quiet as instructed. The old man must have felt the draft from the door because he spoke without turning around. "Is it time for my medication already, Nancy?" His voice was rough but carried a familiar warmth that made Max's chest tighten. "You're earlier than usual." Max stood frozen, unsure whether to respond or run. But before he could decide, the man turned in his chair, and their eyes met. The shock on the old man's face quickly transformed into something else: recognition, then confusion, then a desperate kind of hope. "Jimmy?" he whispered. "Jimmy, is that really you?" Max's throat went dry. Jimmy was his father's name. "And no, sir," Max managed to say. "I'm Max Thompson." The old man's eyes widened, and his hands began to tremble. "Thompson, of course. You look just like him, just like Jimmy did at your age." He leaned forward in his chair, eyes drinking in Max's features. "You're Jimmy's boy, aren't you?" Scout chose that moment to step forward, tail wagging. The old man's face softened as he extended a weathered hand, which Scout gently licked. "And who's this fine fellow?" he asked, his voice growing stronger. "This is Scout," Max replied, finding his own voice steadier. He kind of led me here. Yesterday, he wouldn't stop barking at your door." The old man nodded slowly, as if this made perfect sense. "Dogs know things, don't they? They can sense what's right and what's wrong." He patted Scout's head, then looked back at Max with eyes that seemed to hold entire worlds of sadness. "I suppose you're wondering who I am." Max nodded, though he was beginning to form a theory, one that seemed impossible yet felt undeniably true. "My name is Frank Thompson," the old man said quietly. "And unless I'm very much mistaken, I'm your grandfather." The words hung in the air like smoke, changing everything Max thought he knew about his family. His grandfather? But his father had always said his grandparents were dead. Had always refused to talk about them, changing the subject whenever Max asked questions about that side of the family. But why are you here?" Max asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Why doesn't anyone know about you? Why did Dad say you were?" Frank Thompson's face crumpled slightly, and he turned to look out the window again. "That's a long and painful story, my boy. One that your father has spent many years trying to forget." He paused, then added softly, "Though it seems he's succeeded better than I ever could." Max took a step closer, drawn by the sadness in his grandfather's voice. Scout had already settled at Frank's feet, as if he'd known him all along. "Will you tell me?" Max asked. "Please? I want to understand." Frank looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Perhaps it's time someone knew the truth. But are you sure you want to hear it? Sometimes, Max, the truth can be a heavy thing to carry." Max squared his shoulders, feeling older than his 12 years. "I'm sure." Behind them, the door clicked shut, sealing them in with secrets that had been waiting decades to be told. Max's head was spinning when he finally left Pine Grove that afternoon. Scout padded quietly beside him as they walked their bikes home through the drizzling rain, both of them too preoccupied to care about getting wet. The weight of what he'd learned sat heavy in his chest, like a stone that kept getting bigger. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind as he pedaled mechanically through puddles. It was 1975. Your father was just about your age. The story had unfolded like an old photograph being slowly revealed, edges first, then the painful center. Frank Thompson had been a successful architect in the city, respected and well-liked. He'd designed buildings that still stood proud against the skyline, including the original wing of Pine Grove Nursing Home. His wife, Max's grandmother Eleanor, had been a music teacher at the local high school. They'd lived what seemed like a perfect life. Until the accident. "Your grandmother was driving home from a late rehearsal," Frank had explained, his voice growing distant. "It was raining, just like today. The other driver was drunk, ran a red light. His voice had cracked then, and Max had instinctively reached for his hand. "She never made it home." But that wasn't the real secret, Max had learned. The tragedy that followed was what tore the family apart. Frank had fallen into a deep depression after Eleanor's death. He'd started drinking, first a little, then a lot. His architectural firm had been patient at first, understanding. But when he started missing important meetings and making costly mistakes in his designs, they'd had no choice but to let him go. "Your father," Frank had continued. "My Jimmy, he tried so hard to help me. 12 years old, and he was trying to be the adult. Making his own meals, doing his own laundry, even trying to wake me up for job interviews I kept missing. No child should have to do that." Max had felt a chill run down his spine, thinking of his own father at his age, dealing with so much responsibility and pain. The breaking point came 6 months after Eleanor's death. Frank had been drunk, arguing with a neighbor about some trivial matter. Jimmy had tried to intervene, to pull his father away. In his alcoholic haze, Frank had pushed his son aside roughly. Jimmy had fallen, hit his head on the corner of the coffee table. The scar was still there, hidden under his father's hairline, a mark Max had always wondered about but never dared to ask about. "I'll never forget the look in his eyes when he touched the blood," Frank had whispered, tears rolling down his weathered cheeks. "Not pain, not even fear. Just disappointment. Like he'd finally accepted that his father was gone, replaced by someone he couldn't trust anymore." Child services had gotten involved. Jimmy had been sent to live with his aunt, Max's great-aunt Sarah, while Frank was ordered to undergo rehabilitation. By the time he'd gotten sober, Jimmy had refused to see him. The wall between them had been built, brick by brick, with years of pain and silence as mortar. Now, pulling into his driveway, Max felt the weight of this knowledge pressing down on him. His phone showed 3 missed calls from his mother. He'd lost track of time at Pine Grove. But there was something else he needed to do first. Racing up to his room with Scout at his heels, Max pulled out an old shoebox from under his bed. Inside were family photos his mother had asked him to digitize last summer, a project he'd never quite finished. He dug through them frantically until he found what he was looking for, a yellowed photograph he never quite understood. It showed a tall man standing proudly in front of a building under construction. He was younger, his hair dark instead of white, his face unlined by age and grief. But it was unmistakably Frank Thompson. And there, sitting on his shoulders with a gap-toothed grin, was a young boy who could only be Max's father. On the back, in faded ink, "Jimmy and Dad at the Pine Grove site opening, 1974. Max's hands trembled as he stared at the photo. His father looked so happy, so proud to be perched on his father's shoulders. What would that boy think if he could see himself now, refusing to acknowledge the very man he had once looked up to with such obvious love? The sound of a car door slamming made Max jump. His mother was home. He quickly tucked the photo into his pocket and ran downstairs, Scout bounding ahead of him. "Max? Where have you been? I've been calling." His mother's worried expression softened when she saw him, then sharpened again as she noticed his rain-soaked clothes. "Why are you all wet? And why is Scout?" "Mom," Max interrupted, his voice cracking slightly. "I need to ask you something. And I need you to tell me the truth." Sarah Thompson set down her purse slowly, something in her son's tone making her pause. "What is it, sweetheart? Did you know?" Max pulled out the photograph, holding it up. "Did you know that my grandfather is alive? That he's living at Pine Grove?" The color drained from his mother's face. She sank into a kitchen chair, her hand covering her mouth. For a long moment, she just stared at the photograph, then at Max, then back at the photograph. Finally, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "How did you find out?" "Scout found him. Max said simply. Yesterday, and then today. I went back. I talked to him. He swallowed hard. Mom, why didn't anyone tell me? Why did Dad lie about him being dead? Sarah reached out and pulled Max into a tight hug. He could feel her trembling slightly. Oh, Max. It's complicated. Your father, he's carried this pain for so long. Sometimes it's easier to pretend someone is dead than to face the reality of losing them while they're still alive. But Grandpa Frank is sorry. Max protested into her shoulder. He's been sorry for years. He got better, he stopped drinking, I know, his mother said softly, pulling back to look at him. I know he did. But some wounds go so deep that even time can't heal them completely. Your father was just a boy when it happened, younger than you are now. The trauma of losing his mother, then effectively losing his father too, it changed him. Max fingered the photograph in his pocket. What do we do now? Sarah brushed his damp hair back from his forehead, her eyes sad but determined. Now we wait for your father to come home. And then we have a conversation that's been 30 years in the making. Scout whined softly and pressed against Max's leg, as if sensing the emotional storm brewing. Outside, the rain continued to fall, washing away the old and making way for whatever new truth would emerge when James Thompson finally came home to face the past he'd spent so long running from. The sound of James Thompson's car pulling into the driveway felt like a thunderclap in the tense silence of the house. Max sat at the kitchen table, the old photograph lying between him and his mother like a live wire nobody dared to touch. Scout, sensing the gravity of the moment, had positioned himself protectively beside Max's chair. Sarah? Max? Why are all the lights off? James called out as he entered, flicking on the hallway switch. His footsteps grew closer, accompanied by the rustle of his briefcase and coat. Did you guys order dinner? The meeting ran late and I'm starved. He stopped dead in the kitchen doorway. Later, Max would remember this moment with perfect clarity, his father's confused expression shifting to recognition as he spotted the photograph, then morphing into something between fear and anger. Where did you get that? James asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Max felt his mother's hand squeeze his shoulder. Jimmy, she said softly, using his childhood name. Sit down. Please. No. James stepped backward, as if the kitchen table had become electrified. No, we're not doing this. We're not opening this door. I met Grandpa Frank, Max blurted out, the words tumbling from him like water through a broken dam. At Pine Grove. He's there, Dad. He's been there all along, and he... Enough! James slammed his briefcase down on the counter, making everyone jump. Even Scout let out a startled bark. Who told you? Was it Sarah? One of the nurses? Nobody told me, Max said, finding courage in his grandfather's words about truth being a heavy thing to carry. Scout found him. Yesterday, when he was barking at that door? And today, I went back in. You went back? James's face had gone pale. You went back without permission? Without telling anyone? Because you never would have told me. Max stood up, his chair scraping against the floor. You told me he was dead. You lied to me my whole life about having a grandfather. To protect you, James shouted. To protect you from what I went through. From having to watch someone you love destroy themselves, from having to be the adult when you're just a kid, from... He broke off, running his hands through his hair in a gesture of frustration that Max had seen 100 times before. Sarah stood up slowly. Jimmy, he deserves to know. Max found out on his own, maybe it's time. James laughed, a hollow sound that made Max's stomach clench. Time? It's been 30 years, Sarah. 30 years since he chose the bottle over his own son. 30 years since. His hand unconsciously moved to the scar at his hairline. He's sober now, Max said quietly. Has been for decades. He told me everything, Dad. About Grandma Eleanor, about the accident, about what happened to you. He's sorry. He's been sorry for so long. Sorry doesn't change what happened, James snapped, but his voice had lost some of its edge. He slumped against the counter, suddenly looking very tired. Sorry doesn't give me back my childhood. Sorry doesn't erase the fear, the shame, the nights I lay awake wondering if he'd make it home alive. No, Sarah agreed, moving to stand beside her husband. Sorry doesn't change the past. But maybe it can change the future. James closed his eyes, and Max saw something he'd never seen before, tears rolling down his father's cheeks. You don't understand, he whispered. Every time I think about him, I'm 12 years old again. Scared, alone, trying to hold everything together while watching my father fall apart. Max thought about the photograph in front of him, about the smiling boy on his father's shoulders. But that's not all you were, Dad. Before Grandma died, there were good times too. I saw the pictures, heard Grandpa's stories. He told me about how you used to help him in his workshop, how you'd spend weekends building model airplanes together. James opened his eyes, staring at the photograph. His hand trembled as he reached out to touch it. Pine Grove, he murmured. The opening ceremony. Dad had designed it, and he let me wear his hard hat that day. Said I was his junior architect. Scout padded over to James, gently nudging his hand. Max watched as his father absently stroked the dog's head, a gesture that had always seemed to calm him. He kept all the model airplanes, Max said softly. They're on a shelf in his room. And the pictures, he has so many pictures of you growing up. He talks to them sometimes, he told me. Tells them about his day, about the things he wishes he could tell you. Sarah wrapped her arm around James's waist. Your father made terrible mistakes, Jimmy. Unforgivable ones, maybe. But he's also spent 30 years paying for them. Living with the consequences. Trying to be better. He named all the buildings he designed after you. Max added, remembering something else Frank had told him. Not obviously, but if you look at the blueprints, the project names all start with J. Even Pine Grove was officially Project James in the design phase. James sank into a kitchen chair, his shoulders shaking slightly. Scout immediately laid his head in James's lap, offering silent comfort. The kitchen fell quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock and the distant sound of rain against windows. Finally, James spoke, his voice rough with emotion. Does he still play chess? Max nodded eagerly. Every day. He has a board set up in his room. He said he keeps it ready, just in case. Just in case, James repeated softly. He looked up at Sarah, then at Max, his eyes red but clearer somehow. I don't know if I can do this. I don't know if I'm ready to. You don't have to be ready, Sarah said gently. You just have to be willing to try. James reached out and pulled the photograph closer, tracing the outline of his younger self with a finger. 30 years, he murmured. 30 years of running from this. And all it took was a nosy kid and his too smart dog to bring it all crashing back. Max felt hope flutter in his chest like a cautious bird. Will you come with me? To see him? James looked at his son, really looked at him, for what felt like the first time that evening. You look so much like I did at your age, he said softly. Maybe that's why this feels like a second chance. He stood up slowly, squaring his shoulders. Tomorrow, he said. We'll go tomorrow. I can't promise anything beyond that, but tomorrow I'll face this. Face him. Max threw his arms around his father, feeling the rapid beat of his heart. Scout barked once, tail wagging, as if sealing the deal. Outside, the rain had finally stopped, and a shaft of late afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, painting the kitchen in shades of gold. Tomorrow would bring whatever it would bring, but for now, in this moment, a bridge 30 years in the making had begun to rebuild itself, one painful truth at a time. The next morning arrived with a clarity that seemed almost too perfect, bright sunshine streaming through windows that had been pelted with rain just hours before. Max hardly slept, tossing and turning with anticipation. Scout had stayed by his side all night, occasionally offering a comforting paw or gentle nuzzle when Max's anxiety peaked. They arrived at Pine Grove just as the morning shift change was happening. Max noticed his father's hands trembling as he turned off the car engine, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Sarah had stayed home, saying this needed to be something between father and son, both sets of them. "Dad?" Max said softly. "We don't have to go in right away. We can sit here for a minute." James Thompson let out a shaky breath. 30 years, he murmured. 30 years since I've seen him. What if he doesn't recognize me? He will, Max assured him, remembering how quickly Frank had noticed his resemblance to young Jimmy. He recognized me just because I look like you did. They made their way through the front entrance, Scout walking between them like a furry guardian angel. Mrs. Hendricks was at the nurse's station, and her eyes widened when she saw James. "Mr. Thompson," she said, her usual stern demeanor cracking slightly. We weren't expecting." "It's okay, Nancy," James said quietly, and Max realized with a start that his father knew her name. "How long have you known?" "About me, about him being here?" Mrs. Hendricks twisted her hands together. "Since the beginning. Your father, he designed this place, you know. When he needed somewhere to stay after rehabilitation, the board offered him permanent residence. He chose that back room himself. Said he wanted to be out of the way, not burden anyone." James closed his eyes for a moment, processing this. "And all these years, our monthly visits to Aunt Sarah. He could see you," Mrs. Hendricks confirmed softly. "Through the window in his room. He'd watch you walk from your car to the entrance. Every month, like clockwork. He never missed it." Max felt his father sway slightly, and reached out to steady him. Scout pressed against James's legs, offering silent support. "Did he ever?" James swallowed hard. "Did he ever try to contact me?" Mrs. Hendricks's eyes filled with tears. "Every year on your birthday, he'd write you a letter. And every Christmas. I have them all. He made me promise to keep them safe, just in case." She reached under the desk and pulled out a thick manila envelope, worn with age. 30 years of letters, Mr. Thompson. 30 years of a father's regret." James took the envelope with trembling hands. Max watched as his father opened it, and pulled out the first letter, dated December 25, 1985. "My dearest Jimmy," James read aloud, his voice cracking. "Another Christmas without you. I saw you today, through my window. You've grown so tall, son. I saw you helping an elderly resident with their walker, and my heart nearly burst with pride. You became the man I should have been." He couldn't continue reading, his hands shaking too badly. Max gently took the envelope of letters and tucked them into his backpack. "Maybe we can read them together later, Dad. Right now, there's someone waiting to see you." They made their way down the familiar hallway, Scout leading the way with confident steps. The morning sun streamed through the old windows, casting long shadows on the faded wallpaper. When they reached the door with the keypad lock, James froze. Max said quietly, "The year you were born." James looked at him in surprise, then let out a choked laugh. Of course he'd use that." His fingers hovered over the keypad for a moment before punching in the numbers. The lock clicked open. Inside, Frank Thompson was sitting in his rocking chair by the window, just as he had been when Max first found him. He was wearing a crisp button-down shirt and his best slacks, as if he'd been expecting them. Maybe he had. Mrs. Hendricks might have called ahead. The old man turned at the sound of the door, and for a long moment, father and son stared at each other across 30 years of silence. "Jimmy?" Frank's voice trembled. "Is it really you this time?" James took a halting step forward. "Hello, Dad?" Frank tried to stand, his legs shaking, and James instinctively moved to help him, muscle memory from a time long past, when he'd been a son who still cared for his father. As their hands touched, both men froze. "Your hands," Frank whispered. "They're so much like mine now. I used to trace buildings for you with these fingers, remember? Show you how to hold a drafting pencil just right. The Winchester Hotel," James said suddenly. "You let me design the fountain in the courtyard. Said my sketch was better than yours." "It was." Frank smiled through his tears. Still is. That fountain's still there, you know. Still working. Like father, like son, we built things to last. James sank into the chair opposite his father, his legs seemingly unable to hold him anymore. Scout moved between them, offering his calm presence to both men. I'm so sorry, Jimmy, Frank said, the words rushing out as if he'd been holding them back for decades. Sorry doesn't begin to cover it, I know. But I need you to hear it, face to face. I failed you. Failed your mother's memory. Let the grief and the bottle destroy what we had. And every day since then, every single day, I've lived with that knowledge. I needed you, James replied, his voice raw. After Mom died, I needed my father. Not what you became. I know, Frank nodded, tears flowing freely now. I know, son. I've had 30 years to understand exactly what I threw away. 30 years to stay sober, to try to become someone worthy of being your father again. I don't expect forgiveness, Jimmy. I just wanted to see you one more time. To tell you how proud I am of the man you became, despite me, not because of me. James reached into his pocket and pulled out the photograph Max had found, the one of them at Pine Grove's opening. We were happy once, he said quietly. Before. We were, Frank agreed. And maybe we can't get that back. But perhaps we can build something new. Something different. I'm not the man I was then, either the good father I started as or the broken man I became. I'm just a grandfather who'd like to know his family, if they'll let me. James looked at Max, who had been watching the exchange with tears in his own eyes. My son, James said softly. Your grandson, he has your gift for seeing the best in people. For believing in second chances. He has your courage, Frank replied. And your mother's heart. The morning sun caught the chess pieces on the small table between them, casting long shadows across the board. Frank gestured to it hesitantly. Do you still play? James looked at the board for a long moment, then reached out and moved a white pawn forward. Your move, Dad. A month had passed since that first chess game, and the small room at the end of Pine Grove's forgotten hallway had transformed. The silence that once filled it had been replaced with the gentle click of chess pieces, quiet conversations, and occasionally even laughter. The room itself looked different too, livelier, more lived in, with new photographs joining the old ones on the dresser. Max sat cross-legged on the floor beside Scout, watching his father and grandfather hunched over their fourth chess game of the afternoon. Sunday visits to Pine Grove had taken on a new routine. They'd still see Great-Aunt Sarah, but now they spent most of their time in Frank's room, piecing together 3 decades of missing memories. Check, Frank announced, moving his bishop with slightly trembling fingers. His face had more color now, and he'd gained some weight. Mrs. Hendricks said he hadn't skipped a meal since the reconciliation began. James studied the board intently, a familiar crease between his eyebrows that Max now recognized in his grandfather's expressions too. You're still as ruthless as ever, Dad. Had to be, to teach you properly. Frank chuckled. Remember when you were 10, and you got so frustrated losing that you knocked all the pieces off the board? And you made me set them up exactly as they were, from memory. James finished, smiling at the recollection. Said it was an architect's exercise in spatial awareness. Max watched the easy exchange with a warm feeling in his chest. It wasn't always this smooth. There were still difficult moments, painful conversations that needed to happen. Sometimes his father would grow quiet and distant, old hurts rising to the surface like bruises. Sometimes Frank's hands would shake so badly he couldn't hold his coffee cup, the weight of guilt becoming almost unbearable. But they were trying. Every day, they were trying. The biggest change had come last week when James had brought in a set of blueprints to show his father. He'd been working on a new community center design, and something about it had been bothering him. The foundation calculations seem off, he'd admitted. I've checked them 3 times, but... Frank had put on his reading glasses, and for the next 2 hours, father and son had bent over the blueprints together, their heads nearly touching as they worked through the problem. Max had watched them slip into a shared language of technical terms and mathematical formulas, 30 years melting away in the face of their common passion. "Checkmate," Frank announced now, bringing Max back to the present. "You're getting rusty, Jimmy." James laughed and began resetting the pieces. "Maybe I'm just letting you win. Building up your confidence before I crush you. Like father, like son," Frank said softly, and this time the familiar phrase held no sadness, only pride. Scout suddenly perked up, his tail wagging as Sarah Thompson appeared in the doorway, carrying a large box. "I found them," she announced triumphantly. "In the attic, exactly where you said they'd be, Jimmy." James jumped up to help her with the box, setting it carefully on the bed. Max moved closer, curious, as his father opened it to reveal dozens of old model airplanes, some fully assembled, others in various stages of completion. "Our weekend projects," Frank explained to Max, his eyes shining. "Every Saturday morning, Jimmy and I would work on these. Your grandmother used to complain about the glue smell all through the house." James pulled out a half-finished Spitfire model, its silver wings dusty but intact. "We were working on this one when..." He trailed off, but instead of the usual painful silence that followed such memories, he continued. "Maybe we could finish it now." Frank's hands trembled as he reached for the model. "I'd like that, son. I'd like that very much." "Me too," Max exclaimed. "Could you teach me too, Grandpa?" The word grandpa still felt new on his tongue, but the joy it brought to Frank's face made it worth any awkwardness. James looked at his son for a long moment, then nodded. "Every Saturday," he said firmly. "We'll come every Saturday morning, just like we used to. If that's okay, Dad?" Frank had to clear his throat several times before he could speak. "More than okay." Sarah pulled out her phone and snapped a picture of the three of them examining the model airplane together, Scout's curious nose just visible at the edge of the frame. "For the wall," she explained, gesturing to where new photos had started appearing alongside the old ones. Max's school pictures, family vacation snapshots, moments from the past month of reconciliation. Later that afternoon, as they were preparing to leave, Frank called Max back for a moment alone. "Thank you," he said simply, pulling his grandson into a tight hug. "Your father is learning to forgive me, but you never needed to forgive because you never judged. You just saw a door that needed opening." Max hugged him back, breathing in the familiar scent of wood shavings and peppermint that seemed to cling to his grandfather. "Scout saw it first," he deflected, but Frank shook his head. "Scout may have found the door, but you had the courage to walk through it. To face the truth and help others face it too. That's a rare gift, Max. Don't ever lose it." In the car ride home, Max watched his father's reflection in the rearview mirror. James was smiling slightly, humming an old tune that Max recognized from Frank's room, a lullaby he now knew that his grandmother used to sing. Scout dozed in the back seat beside Max, probably dreaming of the treats Frank always saved for him. The setting sun painted the sky in shades of gold and purple, and Max found himself thinking about doors, the ones that stay locked for years, the ones that dogs can somehow sense need opening, and the ones that, once opened, can never quite be closed again. "Dad?" he asked quietly. Are you glad? About everything that happened?" James was quiet for a long moment, his hands steady on the steering wheel. "I'm glad you found him," he finally said. "I'm glad you were braver than I was. And I'm glad that sometimes the truth we run from turns out to be the very thing we need to face to move forward." They turned onto their street just as the first stars were appearing in the darkening sky. Ahead lay home, dinner, homework, all the normal routines of their life. But now those routines held something new, the promise of Saturday mornings with model airplanes, chess games that bridge generations, and the quiet healing that comes from choosing love over fear, truth over silence, and forgiveness over pain. Scout's tail thumped against the seat, as if in agreement with everything that had gone unspoken. After all, he had known all along what the humans had taken so long to discover, that sometimes the greatest mysteries aren't locked behind doors at all, but within the hearts that need only the courage to open them.